Putin is back on the hunt, looking for fresh bodies to feed into his war machine. On September 29th, Vladimir Putin signed yet another decree, calling up 134,000 Russian citizens to report for mandatory military service. From October 1st until December 31st, men aged 18 to 30 who aren't even part of the reserves will be summoned to enlist. But realistically, no one's going to volunteer. Instead, what we're likely to see is Russian authorities resorting to snatching young men off city streets, from apartment blocks, even from their workplaces. Essentially kidnapping their own citizens just to meet recruitment targets. And if they succeed, then this year's recruitment drive will be Russia's largest forced conscription wave in nearly a decade. Officially, Russia's own constitution guarantees that these conscripts should only serve 1 year, and strictly within the nation's borders, well away from any active combat. But if history repeats itself, and it usually does, then these men might soon find themselves dodging bullets in the meat grinder, just like countless recruits before them. In this video, we'll expose how Russia's military has finally hit rock bottom. Why do Russian men turn down massive paychecks, hefty signing bonuses, and even promises of unlimited vodka, just to stay far away from Putin's army? And more importantly, you'll see that it's not simply the incompetence or stupidity of its soldiers that's dragging Russia towards defeat, but rather how the Russian government itself has sabotaged its own army from within, stacking every possible odd against its own people, making defeat inevitable. As of this summer, Russia has already suffered over 1 million casualties since the invasion began, with at least 250,000 soldiers confirmed dead. Yet, even now, Putin continues trying to lure hundreds of thousands of young Russian men into abandoning everything in their lives, to go and fight and die in a war that seems more unwinnable by the day. As of 2025, the conditions on the front line have deteriorated so severely that Ukrainian troops barely even need to fire a shot, and yet thousands of Russian soldiers continue dying every single week, purely because of the shocking incompetence and neglect of their own commanders. The Russian military is in such a sorry state that for the last 2 years, new conscripts have even been forced to buy basic equipment with their own money. We're talking absolute essentials here: boots, socks, warm thermal layers, even body armor. All the stuff that the Kremlin either can't or simply won't provide. It's gotten so bad now that some conscripts have started buying their equipment before they're even enlisted, knowing full well that they'll get nothing from the army. In fact, as early as 2022, the price of a single bulletproof vest skyrocketed to 20 times its pre-war cost. A 5th grade vest costing 7,000 rubles in January spiked to an unimaginable 135,000 rubles by year's end. And today it's likely even worse, because the so-called bulletproof vests issued by the Russian government often turned out to be nothing but cheap cardboard padding stuffed into fabric shells instead of Kevlar, forcing these young men to spend outrageous sums just to avoid being slaughtered. But tragically, we're just getting started. Over these few years, Russian soldiers have literally frozen to death in trenches because their government-issued winter gear wasn't insulated properly, often disintegrating within days, leaving troops exposed to lethal cold and frostbite. Imagine being an ordinary man, barely trained, sent into combat with equipment so faulty that hypothermia and frostbite become a bigger threat than enemy fire. And don't expect any help if you're wounded. Basic first aid kits handed out to soldiers are either decades past their expiry dates or completely empty. If a Russian soldier is shot, forget tourniquets or sterile bandages, all they're sometimes given are tampons. Yes, you heard that right. Tampons to stuff into bullet wounds to stop the bleeding. Yet somehow it gets even worse because food is another nightmare entirely. Numerous reports and videos from the front lines have exposed how Russian soldiers are starving in their own trenches. Supply convoys regularly fail to deliver rations, either due to corruption, where supplies are siphoned off by corrupt officers, or due to logistical breakdowns, leaving soldiers starving for days on end. And even when rations finally do show up, they're often nothing more than expired canned food or moldy bread. In desperation, soldiers have resorted to scavenging whatever they can find in nearby villages or abandoned homes. Some have even been recorded eating stray animals, dogs, cats, even rodents, to avoid starvation. And worst of all, a leaked intercept from Ukraine's military intelligence exposed a horrifying incident where food shortages drove soldiers to cannibalism. A Russian soldier, identified by the call sign Brelok, reportedly killed and consumed his fellow soldier, known as Foma, over the course of 2 gruesome weeks. Now, we couldn't independently confirm this audio's authenticity, and honestly, for humanity's sake, let's hope it's fake, but unfortunately, Brelok is hardly the only cannibal at the Russian front lines. Alongside murders and violent crimes, Russia has knowingly deployed convicted cannibals to fight in its war. Take Dmitry Melishev, a convicted cannibal sentenced to 25 years for murder and other gruesome crimes. He was recruited into Russia's notorious Storm V penal battalions, alongside Alexander Maslenikov, a serial killer infamous for the brutal double murder and dismemberment of 2 women. And then there's the incident where around 80 Russian soldiers, led by special forces officers from Russian military intelligence, ended up completely trapped without any supplies. Starvation at the facility became so severe that soldiers began hunting and eating stray dogs. Worse still, after the siege, Ukrainian troops discovered Russian bodies with pieces of flesh and organs missing. Within that same group of 80 soldiers, 2 men were reportedly executed by their commanders, simply for drinking more water than allowed from a rationed bottle. Stories like these first break on Telegram, the platform that Russian and Ukrainian soldiers use like Twitter to share firsthand experiences. Every single day, it seems, there's another story from Russia that's even more shocking and surreal. This brutality explains exactly why young Russian men are desperately avoiding conscription at all costs. Because no matter how patriotic they might feel, joining Putin's war could quite literally be a death sentence. If this war drags on another year or two, the majority of Russia's casualties won't even come from Ukrainian bullets, but rather from Russia's own staggering incompetence and sheer disregard for human life. Russian leaders themselves are notorious for extreme torture and cruelty towards their own men. Take the case of Russian private Andrei Sychov. In early 2006, he had his legs and genitals amputated after developing severe frostbite. Sychov and at least 7 other conscripts had been forced to squat for hours in freezing snow during brutal beatings on New Year's Eve celebrations. As a result, Sychov developed a gangrenous infection, but his commanders delayed hospitalizing him until January 4th, by which point he was in critical condition and unable to stand. Or how, on October 25th, 2019, conscript Ramil Shamshutinov snapped after what he described as weeks of beatings and threats of sexual assault. He opened fire on his fellow soldiers, killing 8. But before he did, Shamshutinov left behind this message, explaining exactly what had driven him to that point. Then again, in 2018, another conscript, Private Artyom Pakhotin, was punished for smoking in the barracks by having the word petukh, Russian prison slang for rooster or bitch, carved into his forehead. 2 weeks later, he killed himself with his AK-74 during a training drill in the Urals region of Sverdlovsk. His last text message to his mother still resurfaces and goes viral every single year, serving as a haunting reminder of just how cruel and brutal the Russian army truly is. There aren't even official statistics on the number of hazing cases in the army, but according to a report in 2018, more than 1,100 military personnel were convicted of charges of abuse of power, and 372 for violence. And all of that was before the invasion. Now imagine what's happening when these monsters are given free rein, especially with much younger conscripts forced to live under their command for an entire year. In Russia, they call the system Dedovshchina, a brutal system of hazing that started in Soviet times and never went away. Where Western armies have at least tried to stamp out bullying and harassment, in Russia, it's baked into the culture. It's seen as a rite of passage. As a result, soldiers are systematically broken down, traumatized, and taught one lesson above all. If you want to survive, you must inflict pain on the next man in line. Given these horrors, it's little surprise that Russian men will do anything to avoid conscription. Even back in 2020, Alexander Ladynin, a lawyer, ex-soldier, and a member of the Union of Soldiers Mothers of Russia, said his NGO was swamped with desperate calls for help. Around 300 phone calls came in a day, and roughly 10% were reports of hazing. Add to that another 20 emails daily, with at least 1 or 2 describing brutal abuse. And these were just soldiers who dared to speak up. Imagine the thousands of others who stayed silent, enduring the torture in silence for months or even years. Another watchdog, the NGO Mothers' Rights, estimated that only 4% of conscript deaths happened in actual combat. Almost half, 44%, were suicides. That was before the invasion. Today, that number is climbing because soldiers are being pushed not just for refusing orders, but for even speaking out. We've all seen the videos of Russian soldiers begging for food, for winter clothes, for basic supplies. Many of those men were beaten or disappeared soon after. And even if, against all odds, you somehow survive the brutal hazing, the starvation, and the freezing trenches, if you're truly God's favorite, Russia's own equipment might still kill you before Ukraine ever does. Because at the end of the day, a soldier's lifeline is his weapon. Without a reliable rifle, you're already dead. And for many Russians, that's exactly the reality. In some cases, soldiers describe being pulled straight from buses or barracks, given a few hours of training, then shoved into battle with weapons they barely know how to load. One leaked video showed an entire unit being handed rifles mid-journey to the front. When they finally got their hands on them, half of them didn't work, Some of them were missing springs and magazines, some had cracked stocks or rusted barrels, and others had chambers that wouldn't even close. In the end, those men had to scavenge and pool together whatever semi-functional rifles they could, just to make sure a handful of them had something that might fire when it mattered. And this disaster isn't limited to small arms. Heavy weapons units faced the same catastrophe. Anti-tank systems, mortars, grenade launchers, often misallocated, defective, or missing altogether. In some sectors, infantry are ordered to assault fortified Ukrainian positions with nothing but rifles and grenades. Predictably, whole units are wiped out, sacrificed for nothing. Even the ammunition, explosives, and bombs given to Russian soldiers often turn out to be completely fake or defective. In multiple cases, after inspecting destroyed artillery positions and weapon emplacements, troops discovered shells fired with nothing more than wood chips or plaster, mixed with small traces of chemicals, materials intended to look and feel like real explosives, but entirely incapable of detonating. While I can't point to a single verified factory name here, multiple front accounts mention encountering dud munitions, misfires, and fake charges. Soldiers literally risk their lives throwing grenades that may or may not go off. The real tragedy is that none of this is even a secret. Telegram has made sure every Russian knows exactly what's happening on the front lines. And yet, despite all of this, the Russian Ministry of Defense continues to do absolutely nothing. Over these few years, Telegram has become the lifeline for both Ukrainian and Russian soldiers. It's flooded with horrifying videos and messages from the front. Mothers, fathers, wives, brothers, at this point almost everyone in Russia knows that the army is rotting from the inside out. Corruption hasn't even spared their most critical weapons. Tanks and armored vehicles are falling apart before they ever reach the front. Even after more than 2 years of fighting, a massive share of Russia's heavy equipment losses aren't from Ukrainian missiles. They're from mismanagement, corruption, and something as basic as missing fuel. At the start of the invasion, dozens of tanks broke down in random fields, abandoned with their crews stranded, perfect targets for Ukrainian drones to hunt down. Honestly, one of the biggest reasons Russia is struggling isn't because of how fiercely Ukraine is fighting. It's because of decades of corruption eating away at the Russian military from the inside. Generals, commanders, and defense officials have been looting the military budget for years, pocketing millions that were supposed to keep the army combat ready. For example, imagine a Russian general receiving orders to stockpile thousands of shells and missiles. Standard practice meant to keep the army ready, just in case a war breaks out. But deep down, this general never actually expects Russia to get into a real full-scale conflict. Instead, he sees this massive military contract as an easy way to pocket money for himself and retire comfortably. So he approaches suppliers with a simple yet corrupt proposition. Produce just a fraction of the actual explosives ordered, fill the rest of the shipment with dummies, hollow shells stuffed with sand, sawdust, or even cement. In return, he receives a hefty bribe, allowing him to buy that villa in Spain he's been eyeing for years. Suppliers are happy too. Cutting corners means sky-high profits. They deliver crates of fake ordnance that look convincing enough to pass a lazy inspection, and the boxes sit in warehouses for years. And for years, no one has noticed anything, because nobody expects they'll ever need it in real combat. But then, when war finally breaks out, commanders at the front lines urgently request munitions, tanks, and rocket launchers from storage facilities, assuming they're fully stocked. But when these crates reach the front line and get opened up, soldiers find themselves staring at worthless junk. Shells that won't explode, rockets that barely ignite, grenades packed with concrete. Soldiers are forced to go into battle under-equipped, sharing rifles, charging fortified positions with nothing but grenades and hope. This same rot has infected maintenance as well. Billions of rubles meant to keep tanks and armored vehicles battle-ready were siphoned off through fake paperwork. Commanders signed off on completed repairs that never happened, spare parts that were never delivered, and services that were never performed. And that's why Russia's once mighty force of 10,000 tanks has proven almost useless in reality. Even the ones that still work are crippled by stolen fuel or black market spare parts. The humiliation runs so deep that Ukrainians have repeatedly captured abandoned Russian tanks in near working condition, repaired them, and then just sent them back into battle. This time against the very army that lost them. And while Russia is bleeding equipment, it's also bleeding men. So desperate for manpower that Moscow has resorted to hiring thousands of North Koreans to fill its ranks. What makes you think they won't throw conscripts into the same meat grinder? Legally, these men are supposed to serve only within Russia's borders, far from combat. But from day one of this war, conscripts have been pushed illegally to the front. Captured Russian soldiers, video evidence, and even intercepted calls confirm it. Conscripts are dying at the front lines. In Kursk, in Kharkiv, across occupied territories. And the regime is making sure that refusing draft orders isn't an option. The moment a man gets a digital draft notice, ignoring it comes with brutal consequences. He's barred from leaving Russia, stripped of his driver's license, blocked from buying or selling property, cut off from bank loans, and even forbidden from registering a small business. regional governments can pile on even harsher measures, like cutting social benefits for entire families if a son doesn't report. But even with these threats, people are running for their lives. And in response, the Russian military has taken things further, into outright kidnapping. Recruitment officers and police teams now wait at metro stations, supermarkets, even outside of apartment blocks, snatching men off the streets to meet quotas. This is how far Russia has fallen, fighting a war not just against Ukraine, but against its own people. But unless and until it confronts the corruption and decay rotting its military from within, Russia will never win.